feel a little like the odd man out here because I am developing mobile AR and everybody else is doing all this very cool VR and XR stuff. So in 5 minutes, making mobile AR. I've been working in the XR space since about 2018, and I got into it for multiple different reasons. But one of them is I was living in a tiny house. I like to build things, and I had zero storage. I figured out with mobile AR that I could build gigantic things and put them in a tiny little box. That's actually my house on the right-hand corner and a prototype that I was building. So how do you do this? Next slide, please. So I use three main strategies when producing augmented reality. The first is the time-tested image targets, where you pick an image, you assign your content to that particular image. When a user points their device at that image, your content appears. This is fantastic for things like business cards, Christmas cards, or my personal favorite, murals, because you can make things gigantic. Now, the next strategy that I use is plane detection. This is when your user points their device at a flat surface, primarily horizontal planes, but vertical and instant meshing have been getting better over the years. Once that plane is found, it's used as an anchor and your content is placed on that plane. And this is great for putting your content into the real world alongside them. Add a shadow, fake shadow, or a shadow caster to that plane, and it gives it that little extra realism. Now, the last strategy is VPS, or Visual Positioning System. This uses a pre-scanned or a scan of an area and then your user's GPS location to start looking for visual cues of that particular area and then assigns your AR content accordingly. This is great for geospatial games or when you want to guide people along a particular area. So how do you pick which one of these strategies you want to use? Next slide, please. You plan things, right? If you're working with a team, I highly suggest a design document so you're all on the same page. I know that's been brought up a couple times before, which is great. Or if you're working on your own, at least sketch out your app flow on a napkin so you know how things are going to go, or make some sketches or storyboards, which were brought up before. Once you've done that, pick your game engine. I primarily use Unity because it uses C# and object-oriented programming, which makes it a really comfortable environment. Then you want to gray box your experience. And by this, I mean use cubes and spheres to make your application work. Just make sure that it's fun. If it's fun with boxes, it will be very fun with cool looking assets. Next slide, please. Which brings us to creating assets. I use Blender and Nomad Sculpt for poly modeling and texturing. But when you are creating your assets, it's never too early to start thinking about optimization for your application. And by this, I mean keeping your poly counts and your texture counts low. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the base element of a mesh is a vertex. If you connect two vertices, you get an edge. And if you connect 3 or more edges, you get a poly or face. And when you're modeling, you can end up with millions of these. So you want to keep those low or your AR application is going to grind to a halt. So just because you're keeping your poly count low doesn't necessarily mean that your model has to lack detail, because you can always add that back in with normal maps or height maps. So once you've got your models ready, it's time to start putting it all together. Next slide, please. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a screen grab of Unity. That's the asset from the previous screen. The gold and red image is a scale model of the image target that I was using for the live performance. And in this case, the blue cube is me. On the right-hand side, you can see a snapshot from the live performance, which has the AR model, the image target, and then me on stage. So once you've got everything working, there's one thing that you don't want to forget, and that is audio. So next slide, please. Now, you can use audio in a lot of different ways. On the right-hand side, this is a sound reactive mural that has objects move depending on the frequency band of a particular audio track, or you can simply use audio to enhance the visuals, like sound effects for that second slide. But in AR and XR particularly, as was brought up before, the more important thing is spatial audio. And this is placing audio so it feels like it's in the real world with your user. By that, I mean it will pan from one side to the other, or it will get louder or softer depending on their distance to that audio source. source. Now, the last two images there are a projector, and we used spatial audio to draw the user's attention across the street to the preview for the theater we were building the application for. Now, this works fantastic if you have headphones. It is terrible when you have just regular mics or regular speakers in your device, which we only found out through testing, which brings us to the next slide, please. Test, 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 then test it again. No matter how well you build something, somebody's going to break it. When you are building your application, you create these unconscious biases of how the app is going to work. And the only way to get over those is to put your application into as many hands and onto as many devices as possible to find these out. Now, you want people to break things before you publish, because that way you can fix them before you go live, which brings us to the next slide, which may be publishing, which may be the hardest part of this entire process because you have to deal with Apple and Google. You will need a developer account for each of the platforms. You'll have to jump through each platform's specific hoops and then submit your application for review. Then once you hopefully get accepted, you have now published an AR application. And last slide. So go make something cool.
Crash course on development. Thank you. You pretty much hit it all too, so that was great. I guess I'll ask you to throw this one out there. Well, you pointed this out, so I'm going to ask about it. You are working on mobile as opposed to VR, so I guess what's drawing you or excites you more about working with the augmented reality compared to virtual reality?
That is a really good question. One thing that draws me to it is everyone here has a phone in their pocket. Not everyone has a headset. So barrier to entry is 0.
Show of hands, how many of you have a headset?
Okay, that's not fair.
I know.
We're at
All right, so I'm gonna throw, okay, so your background spans juggling, fine arts, game development. How do these different skills influence your approach to this?
That's another good question. And actually, this is why I wanted to bring up the gray boxing part of things, because coming from fine arts, I fall into the trap of wanting to make things look pretty before getting them to work. So I highly suggest make it work with boxes and cubes before you make it look cool. That's been brought up before, but I can't stress it enough.
You're going through questions fast, so this is good. I can keep going. What's one project that you've worked on that really sort of pushed the boundaries of what you thought was possible?
So in 2019, a team and I were accepted to Niantic's first Beyond Reality competition. And we built a geospatial pirate game, steampunk pirate game. And really, as I mentioned, I like to make things big. Their whole thing was burn these phones. So we didn't worry about poly count. We didn't worry about size. We just made gigantic. It was a mix of dodgeball and Risk. So you literally had to, some of these ships were 100 feet long. I think there were a couple slides in there before. So when you were dodging cannonballs and shooting back, you had to run. So that was pushing it for me.